Thank you very much. So welcome everybody. So glad to be here. You know, I feel, when I'm around a bunch of folks who are doing work in engineering and science, I feel, because I am not an engineer and I am not a scientist, I am just a lowly political scientist. And my laboratory has been the laboratory of democracy that is Michigan. And so I want to start by start this conference really by saying we've got to open up a little bit and think broadly. And so I just wanted to kick off a few ideas where data and AI, robots, et cetera, might be helpful, which is of course the theme of this particular conference, rather than harmful. And in that vein, I want to start, and I apologize to my citrus friends who've heard this story, but this is for me, I'm completely obsessed because I had this defining moment when I first came to office, and it will explain why this subject area is so important, okay? So I was elected as governor in 2002 and took office in January of 2003. And for those of you who remember, we were just coming through a national recession. George Bush was president. And, for me as a brand new governor, when you're coming through a recession, but you're on the tail end, and you're in a state like Michigan, the old motto was, when the nation catches a cold, Michigan catches pneumonia, because we were building cars, right? And in a recession, there's pent up, people don't buy cars. They don't buy big consumer products. But at the end of the recession, there's pent up demand, and people will all of a sudden buy cars. So my advisors were saying to me, oh, what a great time to come in. We're going to create all kinds of jobs. You'll get the credit. Perfect time. Well, at the end of my first year in office, this did not happen. By the end of my first year, we weren't starting to turn around. And in fact, I got a call from the fellow who's the vice president of the Michigan Economic Development Corporation. This is the beautiful state of Michigan. How many of you guys have been to Michigan? All right, love that. So he says, we have a big problem. We have in Greenville, Michigan, the little city of Greenville, town of 8,000 people, they had a huge refrigerator factory. And that factory, he said to me, is going to go to Mexico. And I said, well, how many people work in the factory? He said, almost 3,000 of the 8,000 people. So as you can imagine, this is like a one company town, right? And so I said, as the new governor, there is no way we are going to allow that to happen. There's no way we are going to allow our Electrolux factory, which was in fact the largest refrigerator factory in North America, to go to Mexico. And so we are going to go to Greenville, I said to my team, and we are going to, and I brought the whole cabinet with me to Greenville, and I said, we're going to put an offer on the table to Electrolux to keep them here. We'll make them an offer they can't refuse. Not like a Chris Christie offer or whatever, but we were going to put incentives on the table and stuff like that. And so we go to Greenville, and we went to the city hall of Greenville, and I swear the city hall was probably the size of this row of seats, but all, maybe a little bigger, but all of the grand poobahs of Greenville were there. The mayor was there, and the head of the UAW who represented the workers, the head of the city council, the head of the community college, everybody was there. And we all basically sort of emptied our pockets of chips and made a big pile and slid our chips, our incentives, this is a metaphor, across the table to the management of Electrolux. And the management of, and in this pile, by the way, of incentives were things like zero taxes, state and local, for 20 years. And the UAW was offering such a huge amount of concessions. They didn't even want anyone to know how much they were willing to give because they wanted to save their jobs so badly, right? And we were going to help build them a new factory because the factory was getting pretty run down. We would help to finance the new factory. We put everything we had into this. The community college was going to retrain all the workers, everything. So Electrolux takes our list of incentives, and it was a list, it wasn't a pilot. They walked outside the room and conferred for 17 minutes. And they come back in and they say, wow, this is the most generous any community has ever been. in trying to keep jobs. But there's nothing you can do to compensate for the fact that we can pay $1.57 an hour in Juarez, Mexico. And so we're going to go. When this happened, this is a guy leaving on the last day. When this happened, it was like a nuclear bomb blew up. And I was so devastated because I was a new governor and I'd failed to keep this factory. And on in the month that the last refrigerator came off the assembly line, the employees there had a gathering that they called the Last Supper. It was at a big pavilion in Greenville, Michigan, Clackle's Orchard Pavilion. It was an indoor thing, and I went to the Last Supper, even though I was not invited, because I felt so horrible that I wasn't able to stop this. And as I get in the pavilion, there's all these people eating, around 8 top tables, eating out of boxed lunches, and there was a sad band playing, or a band playing sad music, one of the two. But I go up to the first table, and there's a guy, he stands right up, and he's got his tiger cap on, and he's got tattoos, I remember, and he pulls his daughters. He had like 2 young teenage daughters, and he pulls them next to me. He says, "Go, come here." I'm like, okay. And he says, "I want you to meet my girls." He says, "Because I have worked at this factory for 30 years. I'm 48 years old. I went from high school to factory. My father worked at this factory. My grandfather worked at this factory. All I know," he said, "is how to make refrigerators." And then he looks at his girls and he puts his hand on his chest like this. "Tell me, Gov, who is ever gonna hire me? All I know is how to make refrigerators. Who is ever gonna hire me?" And that question was asked by everybody. There were 1,000 people in Clackle's Orchard Pavilion that day. Everybody was asking themselves the same question. And it's been asked, this is an image of the factory being imploded in Greenville and the new factory that was built in Juarez, Mexico. And that question was asked by everybody who's worked in one of the 70,000 factories that have gone away in America between 2000 and 2017. Obviously, it's not just Greenville. In fact, you ask yourself, I ask myself all the time, is it about globalization? I used to campaign, and I totally get why Donald Trump won in Michigan. I used to campaign, NAFTA and CAFTA have given us the shafta. That was my motto. And when he was doing stuff about globalization and free trade, because I had experienced this, and so many people in Michigan had experienced, it was deep and profound. I mean, it's still happening, right? All of these tweets today at the General Assembly, he's still talking about the importance of America First trade, all of that. Super important. And in the first half of this, in the first 10 years of this century, globalization played a huge role. In the second 7-8 years so far, and obviously it's been more than that, automation has. What if I told that guy who was moving his chair out on the last day that there are millions right now of 4th graders who are willing to work for 40 cents an hour? Millions coming. And of course, they may not be humans. They may instead be, whoops, such a great picture, I have to show it to you, robots. So is it globalization? Is it automation? Whatever it is, we got to fix it. 2 big problems. The first one I want to talk about is this question of digital systems automating routine work and this issue of whether it is, in fact, globalization or automation. Well, here's the stat, is actually only about 13% of the manufacturing job losses are attributable to trade. The rest, of course, is attributable to increases in productivity. And that, of course, is robots. So it's easy to campaign against, foreign countries who are taking our jobs. It's much more difficult when you're talking about robots. Robots have given us the shafta. That doesn't sound as good. So this is what is being said out there, right? Long-term job loss is not China, but automation. We know, in fact, that American manufacturers, and I focus on manufacturing for this conversation because that's been my experience, but this is the number of employment in manufacturing we've seen go down, but the amount of output has increased. The dips are obviously the Great Recession. And by the way, if you ever run for governor, don't run at this point in time because it really sucks. It's a really challenging period of time. But that's what it looks like right now in terms of output and manufacturing jobs. So there's all of these studies that we have been seeing in the past year, right? Automation to displace 20 to 25% of workers by 2030. That's Bain's. It's a Bain study that's from February of this year. McKinsey saying that automation could eradicate a third. That was from November of last year. This one from last week. Shock report. Machines will do half our labor in less than 8 years. Oh my God, we will have no jobs left. That's what they want us all to believe, right? Or not that they, who's the big they, but in Michigan, this is a big deal. In the Midwest, it's a big deal. In the industrial states, it's a big deal, that fear. Now, this poll was super interesting to me. Right after the election, the question was asked, this is of blue-collar workers, would you rather work full-time in a good-paying factory job or in a good-paying salaried office job? What do you think most people said? You are divided. I can hear it. They were less divided. 72% would rather work in a factory job than in a salaried office job. This is a challenge. It's a challenge for us as we consider what people's skills are because the economy is shedding exactly the kind of jobs that those workers want, right? So it's a political issue. It is a technology issue. It is a policy issue about what we're going to do about it. So the two big problems, digital systems automating routine work, and the second one is that when that happens, it exacerbates income inequality, right? And so, for example, we know that income inequality is at historic heights. You've seen versions of this particular slide all over the place, right? When these kinds of stats appear, it should cause us all huge alarm. 40% of Americans can't pay a $400 expense without selling something to go into debt. They don't have $400 in their bank account. 40% of Americans. Or 42% have less than $10,000 saved for retirement. We don't have pensions anymore. This is a time bomb waiting to explode. We got a major issue that we have to deal with. And when I say that the automation exacerbates, obviously it is because those who own the capital are making out well, and those who have the labor are making out less well, right? The top 10 tech billionaires, this is no insult, it's just a fact. I'm not that you're the billionaire, but you represent one sort of, right? The top 10 tech billionaires own more wealth than 40% of Americans. That's just a huge issue that we have to deal with, and that's part, I think, of our challenge. The tech sector is doing great. They are disproportionately soaring on the Fortune 500, on the Dow. It's going really well for them. And a lot of folks in Silicon Valley have been talking about UBI. You know what that is, right? Universal Basic Income. That people, instead of having to work so hard and so long, especially if jobs are going away, that people should be compensated for just being citizens or for being here in some way and get a check from the government. I don't like the idea of UBI without having some, the dignity of some job or some contribution personally. That's just personally. I think it's not that great, but I have this picture of the pitchforks because a lot of the conversation in Silicon Valley has been about how do we get UBI to appease the masses because we have this huge income inequality problem. So is UBI the only choice? And there's a lot of people who are, and versions of UBI might be really interesting. There's a lot of people probably in this room who have looked at some of the studies on that. But for me, I'm interested in the nexus of whether is AI the problem or could it be a solution? And that's what you'll be exploring this afternoon as well. You all are, many of you are aware of the notion of singularity, which means that humans and robots will merge or that robots will take over and that they'll, kill us all or whatever it is that the fears are depending on who you talk to. Actually, Elon Musk has put out a huge, warning sign about singularity. He's been a big, he's been channeling the fear of singularity for a long period of time. It's a great question for engineering schools. When you train your engineers, should there be some form of Hippocratic oath, do no harm, built into the curriculum so that people are not programming robots to take over people? In fact, I don't know if any of you listened to Joe Rogan's podcast, but Elon Musk was on a couple of weeks ago, and he was saying that you are already a cyborg. How many of you do not have a phone with you? Wow, you are not a cyborg, Peter. But everybody, we have it because we use it for everything. It's just not surgically attached to us yet. But that phone is an extension of yourself. And it makes you able to get from place to place. It adds huge brain power to you. It gives you power to do things you never would have been able to do 20 years ago. And so there's an opportunity here, right? That's the question about what we're looking at today is there a way that we can be enhanced as people, as workers, rather than feeling victimized by it? And that's why you're going to hear from later this afternoon somebody who has been promoting this notion of multiplicity. Ken's not here, is he, Ken Goldberg? He's coming. He's great. And he talks about how AI should be used to enhance the skills of workers and not to displace them. In fact, we've been using the term, not artificial intelligence, but inclusive intelligence. How do you get that intelligence to work for people, to give people abilities that they don't normally have? What a great freeing potential concept that is. So, in that vein, I want to share a few just blue sky ideas with you just to get your creative juices thinking, all right? Idea number one. So if in fact the tech companies like Facebook and Google are using the data that you give them when you do your searches or when you buy stuff online, they're using it, right? And they're making billions off of the information that you give them. Shouldn't you get a little compensation for that? Just a question. Would it be a fair world, instead of UBI, you getting something for nothing, that you get something for having contributed to the wealth of the tech platforms? It's not just me putting that out there as a concept. We all know that The Economist actually has said that the world's most valuable resource now is no longer oil, but data. How do those tech companies value the data that they're gathering from you on their books? Of course, they are booking it, and they're using it, and they're giving it to advertisers so they can give you a personalized experience online, right? And that's the benefit that you get. That's what they would say, right? You get the benefit of a more tailored online experience targeted to you. You don't get ads for stuff you wouldn't buy. You only get ads of stuff that seems to appeal to you, among other things. So the question is there a way to take a look at your data and this movement toward enhancing your privacy That's one step, right? So if Mark Zuckerberg is testifying that every piece of data that Facebook has you own, that you own the ability to say whether they can share it or not, or at least ostensibly, that you can determine that, that's a step in the direction of saying that that data is worth something, that your data is valuable, right? And so if the European Union, for those of you who haven't been following this, the General Data Protection Regulation has just been passed by Europe. And it too is a step in the direction of saying that your data is valuable and you own it. It belongs to you. You decide whether you share it. Well, the next step might be, should you get compensated for that in some way? Next week, Twitter and Facebook are going to continue to testify in front of Congress. This is a hot, hot issue about data protection. And the next hot issue, I think, is going to be whether Facebook and other technology companies will pay you for it. This is a colleague of mine, Chris Eldred. Chris, are you in the room? Chris right here, and I have been writing a couple of pieces for CNN online stuff. But this notion that some out there, not just us, but some in the academic world are looking at whether you can value your data. So for example, if you're an artist and you are singing a song and you put your song out, that's the intellectual property that belongs to the artist, and the artist gets micropayments in the form of royalties, right, every time it's played. Is there a way that you can get micropayments, kind of royalties, every time your data is used? It's not just us, as I say, Facebook Users Unite. There's actually a data labor union that's forming in the Netherlands. Should we treat data as labor, moving beyond free? Is your data labor? Advocates of data as labor think users should be paid for using online services. And the analogy that's often used is the analogy of Alaska. And this is true. This analogy is also used when people consider the universal basic income, which is that Alaska residents get a check every year from the Alaska Permanent Fund. And that fund last year paid $1,600 per person in 2018. And the reason why they get that money is because the stuff that's being pulled out of the ground, the oil, the natural gas, et cetera, that they consider as a resource to all Alaskans. And so they share that dividend through royalties with people who live in Alaska. And so the notion is, can data be the people's natural resource? Is that something worth considering? So Glenn Weil, who's from Yale, and Eric Posner from the University of Chicago have done a good deal of work on this. And they took a stab at trying to value what data would be worth. So you have to imagine how much data is out there, and whose data is somebody's data more valuable than others. But what they said is that if AI, if artificial intelligence represents 10% of the US economy by 2030, then it would mean that paying people for data would raise household median income by $20,000. That's a significant amount. Now, of course, you have to look at, do the data companies are going to want to do that on their own. They don't want to damage their returns. They have shareholders to be able to consider. But the question is there sort of a profit-sharing mechanism that might, in fact, help them reset their reputations? The value of data is going to increase as AI spreads throughout the economy with the Internet of Things, whether it's energy or driving or your Fitbit or of course your online communications. Data is going to be, the need for data, the cloud services, all of that is already starting to be ubiquitous. 10% of the economy seems to me to be a pretty conservative measure by 2030, but who knows? The bottom line is, for the companies, though, could it, Facebook, for example, has been sort of flatlining in terms of the number of users. Could it jumpstart growth? Could people say, oh, I'm going to use Facebook again if they're going to pay me a little bit for my data? I might decide to go back to Facebook. Or could it reset their reputations? Is there some amount that they might be able to carve off to be able to compensate people for giving them the platform success that they have had? So that's idea number one. Lots of questions of that. Of course, how do you value data, who's going to negotiate the data payments on behalf of people. Some have suggested that there's intermediaries that are, intermediary groups that could actually do that, who are trusted. How do you enforce standards? What's the role of government? Some people say it should be the companies alone who decide to do this through their own internal mechanisms. Some people say, oh, government should tax the robots, tax the value of data, redistribute. Whatever those series of questions are, I think you'll see a lot of that starting to percolate up because people have become much more interested in you giving away your personal information for free. All right, that's idea number one. So what could the payments be used for? This one I particularly like because we all know that schooling does not end at college or at K through 12. That what if we created universal, flexible, portable, lifelong learning accounts? There's obviously a huge opportunity with a number of companies who are already providing online services to be educated. If you had the ability to decide what you wanted to be educated in and use that money, that's kind of a freeing and empowering option. And I say that because it's not like it's just out of our brains of the group that's working on these ideas. It is Singapore has started this already. They just last year began the notion of paying people $500 for a portable, flexible, lifelong learning account. This is part of their advertisement. If you want to become expert in flower arranging, you can pay to get that done. If you want to become a coder, you can pay and decide that that's how you want to upskill yourself. So you might be able to consider something like that. Here's the problem for us, though, is that our current workforce training programs are terrible. They are left, they had great intentions when they were started. But the Workforce Adjustment Act, the Trade Adjustment Assistance Act, those acts are so last century. We need updated, certainly, workforce training for today's world. And can AI help to create that kind of workforce training? The studies from the Trade Adjustment Assistance Program, it costs $11,500 per person. Only 37% of the employed participants were working in the industries that they got trained in the following 4 years. Similarly, the Workforce Investment Act, this is a report from 2008, everybody cites, overall it appears possible that ultimate gains from participation are small or non-existent. Billions of dollars being spent on these programs. The Atlantic had an article in January of this year where it summarized that these programs failed to evolve with the global information-based economy in which technical know-how trumps muscle. And so the question is, can we do personalized training with AI? Can personalized learning make training great again? And here's just a quick example, is that out of the Navy, they had a digital tutor program which really took people where they were. Some people didn't have any experience, some people had a lot of experience, and that's of course what happens with digital learning, is that it takes you where you are. It doesn't let you get to the next step until you've mastered the skills of that step. And the great example here, this again is from the Navy and DARPA, the the Defense, what is the acronym? Advanced Research Project, thank you. DARPA, as opposed to ARPA and ARPA-E, anyway, they did this project, and the notion of using these digital training modules improved problem-solving performance by 94% over classroom training. They did this in partnership with the Department of Education. They did found the best deliverer of that service. And it gets me to this notion, which is apprenticeships and on-the-job training should be the rule and not the exception, because many people learn very well when they are on the job and there is something relevant that they're learning to what they are expected to be compensated for. And in that regard, instead of running from AI, we should use it to give displaced workers valuable skills. So what can government do? Well, look at other governments. The Swiss example on apprenticeships, 85% of Swiss apprentices found a job within 3 months. Germany has a similar, very aggressive and robust training. Many of you who are in this space know this very well. closer to home, an example is the Tectonic Group. 87% of their apprentices successfully were placed into tech jobs where the average salary was $75,000, and 82% of the apprentices were from diverse populations. They took people who had not had training in, they placed people in coding and in software jobs. And they took them who had high school degrees or who had college degrees in the arts or whatever, not in this space. And the biggest number that I think is so impressive is that they had such diverse applicants. And especially in the software placement area, which is often disproportionately white and male, their numbers are outstanding, all because it was on-the-job, specific, relevant to a project with a particular client. That kind of model, to me, is exciting. So the question about what's the role of government, instead of subsidizing unemployment and breadlines, why don't we subsidize employment, right? Currently, we spend $24 billion annually on unemployment insurance. What if we split the cost with employers, took the risk down? Employers today expect people to show up fully trained, right? They're not going to pay for a bunch of training. What if we shared the cost a little bit and subsidized employment rather than subsidizing unemployment, subsidized training, and allowed somebody to make a living at the job that they were going to be hired at while they're learning on the job? Other countries do this. We do not. Very 20th century system. Idea number 5, quickly, is competition. I'm all about competition. I totally love it. Don't ever get in a game with me. But you know, you've got public sector competitions like Sunshot from the Department of Energy, private sector competitions like X Prize. To me, one of the best competitions that was run by government is Race to the Top. That was the Department of Education competition back in 2007, 2008, after the recovery, 2007, 2008. What the Obama administration did was put $3.4 billion out for a competition, and they said, all the governors, they said, hey, you can have a slice of this. All you have to do is raise your high school standards to essentially be college prep curriculum. Out of all 50 governors, 48 of them jumped at this competition, raising their standards. There were only 2 states that didn't do it. You know which 2 states? No, California did it. Texas and Mississippi. So anyway, bottom line is, but it was hugely successful because it essentially created national energy policy from the ground up, respected the states, et cetera. What if you did a competition that was really for 21st century worker training, whether it's to the private sector or a competition that requires governors or states to change their rules, et cetera, to be able to encourage AI solutions, personalized learning, so that we take people to the next level? I'm all about the competition. So summarizing, pay people for their data, universal flexible learning accounts, personalized learning, apprenticeships, and competition. 5 ideas that, just to get you thinking about how we might bend the systems that we currently have in order to take advantage of AI. And so the question is, my big conclusion, and I know we're going to get to questions from you, who will get displaced workers into good jobs? Who is going to sustain the middle class in the digital era? Who will save us and the planet from death and despair? Who will ensure AI will be a force for good? Is it President Trump or the next president, whoever she is? Is it Elon Musk or Bill Gates or Mark Zuckerberg? Is it Costas Spanos? Or is it the UC Berkeley brain power? Ta-da! Now, I know you got some questions. Okay, my problem is I left my glasses at home. So unless somebody has a 3.75 reader or better, somebody's going to have to read them to me.
I can ask the first question here. Is, do we need to revalue work? Can AI teach us to not work, but learn how to value leisure, and how?
Oh, this is a really great question. I love the question, right? Wouldn't it be great to be paid what you're paid as a full-time worker, but only have to work half-time, right? And have somebody else picking up all the slack like a robot. I'm all about it. I think it would be great if you want that. if you want that. And that might be super for people who are easing into retirement, or certainly for people who, who have challenges, or for parents who want to be able to spend some time at home with kids. And there's all sorts of places where this could work. The only question is, how do you pay for it, right? How do you guarantee a salary of a certain amount when you're not producing for an entity at that level? Go back to my idea number one. That's all I'm saying.
Okay, I have another question. This one is more pragmatic. So I was born and raised in Detroit. What is the most revolutionary?
Who is
over there in the back corner.
All right, awesome.
So what is the most revolutionary but doable idea you have to help residents other than better education and using AI?
Wow, that is residents of Detroit, or residents overall? Residents in cities. Yeah. Well, I do think that I'm a big believer in economic development strategies that are place-based to bring jobs to communities, especially that have had challenges. Detroit, I know you know this, but for everybody else, is really coming back. It's super exciting. All these people who have decided there's been a diaspora, and a lot of people are coming back. It's very, very great, but you want to gentrify in place too. So you don't want to displace and move people out of their homes, because all of these young people are coming in to start businesses, and you want to encourage that too. So to me, economic development strategies are key. And there is one silver lining in that tax bill that was passed, the horrible tax bill, but Cory Booker and the Senate got a provision in that tax bill which creates opportunity zones, and those are specifically census tract based to very challenged communities. And what the opportunity zone does is get capital, like capital from Bill Gates or Mark Zuckerberg, into these districts and get a benefit, so that they're financial benefits, so they maybe get some break on capital gains or whatever, to get money into those communities so that people get jobs and are trained for those jobs. To me, is the biggest service that we should be providing to citizens in America, not just in Detroit, but in communities all across. And I would say that's true for rural communities as well, who are equally challenged.
I think your point to pay people for their data really struck a chord with our audience, because we have quite a few questions on that. So the first one is, how do we make sure paying people for data doesn't increase inequity?
Right.
Not everyone's data has equal commercial value.
Right. It's the exact right question. And that's why these data labor unions are starting to form. I'm looking at Chris, because he's been looking at a lot of this stuff. These intermediary groups people of surmise would be doing the negotiation on behalf of real people. You do not want to negotiate something that actually exacerbates inequality. You want to value data in a way that addresses the problem and not creates it. But I don't have the answer to that yet. That's why I put it up as a question. It's an issue to be resolved.
I like this question. It's about kind of gaming the system around data. So would paying people for data create industries focused on creating false data for the purpose of profiting?
Yeah. I mean, that's another, all of these things, I think, are things that would have to be looked at, right? If you're able to negotiate a system that values intellectual property in the art world, in the music and art world, then you can do it. In fact, you can set up a digital system to be able to do it, but you have to get the rules, the inputs, the programming right. And that is another issue that has to be a flag to make sure that it's done in the right way.
Here's another one. Given Electrolux's denial of incentives, how do you propose we encourage employers to pursue sharing training costs with the government to help upskill employees?
Yeah, I think this is a policy issue. Obviously, it relates to unemployment. It relates to workforce training. It is true that with a low unemployment rate, a lot of these employers are looking for people who are trained. And if that's not going to happen, then they have an incentive to share. So in Germany, they have something called Kurzarbeit, which is in the soft economy, when employers don't want to lay people off because they like the employees, they share the cost of keeping them on. So the employer pays half and the government pays half to prevent the layoffs. And that kind of sharing to ensure that people remain employed is the kind of sharing that could be applied in the unemployment space as well. You know, they've switched the rules a little bit on unemployment to allow you to, in some states and in some places where there's waivers to allow you to be paid if you're in a training program. But, you know, it should be universal. If you're getting upskilled in some way, you should be able to be trained. If there is an employer who's willing to take you on while you're being trained for a much lower cost, so you take the risk off the employer, but they know that they can look at you while you are training to see whether you'll be a permanent addition to the staff, that to me seems like a logical shift in our unemployment mechanism right now.
How do we make universal basic income truly universal? Because the political systems are very short-sighted, tend to be 4 to 6 years, and also go in political cycles.
That's a question that could apply to almost any policy, right? Is how do you make sure that something lasts? Well, since Congress doesn't appear to be able to get anything done, maybe that's your answer, is that there is gridlock so nothing happens, but you have to get something through. And that's a very difficult thing. So I would just say, make sure that you exercise your right to vote on November 6th and put people in office who are willing to address these issues rather than who are supporting the status quo.
This is a really interesting, how do we tie together data ownership and selling of that data to healthcare? So how could you use data payment to help fund universal healthcare?
Well, that's interesting.
It is.
So what the suggestion is there is that the tech companies are taxed essentially for the data, which, you know, it's one option. I think even Bill Gates had suggested taxing the robots, right? And so sharing in that way so that it's directed toward healthcare. You know, once it comes into the coffers of government, you're not sure where it's going to go, but if you tie it in some way, that's why we were sort of playing with this notion of tying data to universal education, universal training, upskilling. Either way, it would require some kind of carve out or set aside statutorily. It's a policy issue that would be required. Are you done, Brandy? Are you like giving me the hook?
I might have one more. Let's just see if we got one in. Okay, in your Michigan Greenville example, looking back, if incentives don't work, how would you apply your ideas today that could have made them stay?
Well, fortunately, we are seeing that because of automation, there is less offshoring, right? And so perhaps today, they might have been interested in financial incentives to help capitalize the factory. We are seeing that because of the cost, especially for large and heavy products, the shipping costs are starting to trump, if you will, the movement of these industries offshore. And when you combine that with automation, there is a decision to make more stuff here. At least there seems to be a movement in that direction. So that's encouraging. That was not available in 2002, 2003. Automation was obviously there, but it wasn't as ubiquitous as we are seeing today. It would be I would love to do a do-over and go back and see if we could put together a package that would incentivize them to stay. But the delta between $25 an hour and $1.57 an hour is still a huge delta to make up for those who are in the manufacturing sector. You might not have as many jobs, but at least the suppliers in the area would still be able to offer parts to the factory, which they all went bankrupt too. So when a big factory goes, it's a whole ecosystem that goes. It's not just the people who work there. If you're able to keep something there, then you keep the suppliers there too. And yeah, maybe there's not as many people who are working at that individual factory, but you better believe the ripple effect in the economy is 1 in 7. For every 1 factory worker, there are 7 workers who are employed in the economy. And then finally, I would just say this one other thing, that the despair that is all around this, to me, was really brought to, what made me feel much better was that there is a study out of Boston University, a professor named James Besson, and he did an evaluation of 317 professions. In those 317 professions, between 2002 and 2012, I think, he evaluated when technology was introduced. These are 317 professions where technology had been introduced, like ATMs, like barcode scanners. Did employment in those industries increase or decrease? And so to respond to everybody who freaks out about robots taking over, of the 317 professions, there was only one profession that actually went away. And every one of the other ones saw an increase in employment. And the one that went away, does anybody know what it was? Yes, it's the elevator operator. Did you read that study? You're familiar with that study. Are you James Besson? But yeah, the elevator operator. But so the point is that technology can create just as many or more jobs than the ones that it displaces. They're just going to be different, right? More tellers today than there were when the ATM was introduced. Significantly more than the growth in the overall economy. And so there's good news out there.
So because we have you here today and I want to tap into your knowledge, I'm going to ask one last question. I think we have 30 seconds left, and this is a big question.
Oh, so my gosh,
the challenge has been presented. So here's the question. It seems that companies best placed to power an AI-based education program are the same companies that dominate the tech industry. How do we ensure that government does not end up exacerbating monopolies in the tech industry with an AI retraining program?
Right, and that's why I love the idea of a competition. Because, you know, if you do a competition, if you could incentivize governors in their various states to do a competition. There's all sorts of engineering schools all across the country who could do AI-based training programs, and let's see what the laboratories of democracy produce. So to your point, yeah, you do not want to, you know, just make tech billionaire number 11 or tech billionaire number 1 through 10 even more wealthy by creating something that's supposed to address inequality. Although, you know, we don't, I mean, if somebody's rich, that's great, and they've been working hard and good for them, but you want to give other people opportunity to enter into that. And that's why I think a competition where you're not pre-deciding who gets to enter is a really interesting solution, whether it's a private sector competition or a public sector one. So, and with that,
thank you so much.
Thank you
Governor
all
Granholm.
so much. Thanks for Citrus.